we cannot sustain the lockdown indefinitely without doing a great deal of damage to our society. That making people afraid of the world is devastating for social animals like human beings.
And so we should live with that as we have lived with viruses, and we always have. What's your fear? Do you fear that these measures and controls will continue on to keep reducing the risk further and further down? And what is the potential damage of that?
Clearly, there are people who would like to try to suppress the circulation of the virus below what you might think of as its natural limits.
Why do people want to do that?
I think there are two motives for that. I mean, one part of it is the legacy of the climate of fear and the failure, if you like, to recalibrate the risk. So that, last March, although the World Health Organization was saying as early as February 2020 that probably 85% of people who got COVID would never need to go near a hospital. Our television screens, our reporting was filled with these images of death and disaster, and that sort of message has been quite energetically sustained over the last 12 months.
Who do you think is to blame, if there is such a word to be used for that?
Well, as a sociologist, I'm reluctant to use the word blame.
Yes,
I think that
I can think of another one here.
No, if you read the research on media, you understand the dynamics of television, and having your journalists put on a lot of PPE and creep into intensive care units gives you great visuals. It's dramatic, it's exciting, it engages viewers. Whereas coming round to your house, Lucy, where you're coughing and spluttering a bit, and you've got a bad headache, and you feel pretty rough for a few days. Well, nobody's going to put that on the news at 10, are they?
No. I don't know. But do you think that then we've terrorized the nation and absolutely to a disproportionate level in that sense?
Well, terrorizing, again, that's a sort of language of conspiracy, Lucy. I'm not sure that what we have here is anybody's intention, but it's certainly the outcome of the way in which a number of institutions work. It's come together to have that effect on the nation. And it will, I think, require some quite deliberate efforts to unwind that.
And is there any evidence that that's going on? Should the government now be trying to unwind it? Because there are people that haven't left the home. My neighbour is one, hasn't even been out the house for a year. There's lots of those. What do we do?
Yeah, well, you see, I think this was partly, it was maybe ill-timed, but it was partly the thrust behind the Eat Out to Help Out last summer. Now, I think that was perhaps not the best managed of schemes, but I think we may need some things of that kind. I think we could do with much clearer messaging about these are the small areas of social life in which there is a residual risk of infection that is noticeable. But for others, I think that we may, by the end of the summer, need to see some sort of campaigning about get out there and make the most of it. And thinking about how to achieve that.
If the population at large, and the Labour Party particularly, and large part of the Conservative Party are pro-lockdown, they want more restrictions, they're worried about variants, they're now worried about Europe. What's the political mileage in doing a campaign to release fear and why are we continuing with this messaging if actually, the risk is becoming as you say it is?
Well, I think this is where we come into the politics of it again, Lucy. I think that we are in a situation where we've almost got a kind of institutional paralysis. That we've had this pandemic of action. We don't know which bits of it have worked. We don't really know which bits of it are worth sustaining for a longer period, and which can be safely discarded, in part because there's been so little engagement of the social sciences throughout this episode. And we cannot sustain the lockdown indefinitely without doing a great deal of damage to our society. That making people afraid of the world is devastating for social animals like human beings. We cannot sustain the lockdown indefinitely without doing a great deal of damage to our society. That making people afraid of the world is devastating for social animals like human beings. It's been, it was why I was objecting to masks even before the evidence was clear that they brought very little benefit.
Is the evidence clear? There's plenty of studies that show they do reduce transmission. In lab studies have shown that, and using the right masks if people wear them properly. Is that clear?
Well, I think you've said it yourself, Lucy. You're talking about lab studies, people wearing high particular quality masks, wearing them properly, and even under those conditions, the effects are modest. Well, the benefits of putting a bit of cotton around your face when you go to the supermarket, especially given that modern supermarkets are well ventilated environments, are probably barely noticeable.
What's the damage? What's the harm of just putting something around your face? Do you think there is a harm?
Well, this is what some of the public health people are saying, that actually it's all about the symbolic force, and reminding people that there's a pandemic on. One of the things that sociologists know about is symbolism. And if the symbolism is be afraid every time you set foot outside your front door, be afraid every time you encounter another human being, make space, keep distance, minimize social interaction, stop doing all of the things that are really intrinsic to the functioning of any social group, since humans started forming them.
Do you believe that's why masks are being used? You don't believe they're being used to inhibit transmission?
Clearly there are those who will argue that the weak evidence of a small benefit justifies the use of the mask. But alongside that, you've also got people who say, well, yes, we know they're rubbish, but we still think that people ought to be made to wear them because we want them to continue to be afraid of other people.
And you think that in a pandemic, that's not appropriate?
Well, you have the problem about how do we emerge from the pandemic?
Yeah.
Now, if we had decent evidence that masks were interrupting transmission, if we'd done, for example, randomized controlled trials in schools, which we could easily have done from last September, 10 big comprehensives where everybody, children and teachers, wear masks all the time, 10 big comprehensives where nobody wears masks ever, and see what happens to the infections. And we could easily have done it, and we chose not to. And
it worked when you've got the super spreading events, and we don't know what people are doing outside the realm of the classroom. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of this, but I just wondered if that would be methodologically flawed. You couldn't really measure. It's a difficult one to do, isn't it?
Randomized trials of social interventions are never easy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you have a big enough sample of schools, children, and teachers, then you can assume that those other events are happening randomly.
Yeah.
It's
So
a reasonable assumption to make.
It's the so what thing, the kids can just put them on, that's it. And if it does some good and it saves a few people, that's worth it. What do you say in counter to that?
Well, firstly, of course, that there are a lot of kids for whom the interruption of communication will be damaging to their education. There are the kids with communication difficulties. There are the kids with neurodiverse conditions. You've got a very significant chunk of any school that is that will be educationally disadvantaged by this. But you've also got the concern about what is the symbolic messaging here, and if it is, kids get a hard enough time in schools about school uniforms. I mean, you've got kids. You must know about this. You have the right skirt. You have the right shoes. You have the right. You don't have the jewelry. You have the right hairstyle. And now here's something else, and it's something that is deliberately there to create a barrier between you and your classmates, your teachers. To freeze those. To put a chill on those interactions that are fundamentally the way in which human beings learn from each other, collaborate with each other, cooperate with each other.
Would you like to see them just banned right now?
I mean, on the question of masks, Lucy, I think it is pretty clear that there are very few circumstances where you could argue that there is a small but clear benefit. There might be things like rush hour on the London Tube as we used to know it, where you have intense crowding for short periods, for significant periods of time. If you're at a big football stadium and you're going through a narrow passageway between the outdoors where you are queuing to get in and the indoors where you're going to be sitting in a stand seat, then the transience of that, the shortness of the exposure, means it's pretty unlikely that you're going to pick up an infection. Once you get into the stadium, there are probably good reasons for insisting that people remain in their seats, and that which will be unpopular with a lot of football fans. But the seating provides a natural social distancing. You don't, on the whole, breathe over the people next to you, sitting next to you. And if you're shouting and cheering and you're sitting down, you're doing that over the head of the person in front. And the air currents around will be tending to carry any particles up and away, rather than into places where anybody else is going to breathe them. So it's I know it's really getting down to a level of detail, but that's what I mean about talking about, if you like, risk assessments rather than rules, and understanding the principles and understanding what the real life situations are, and thinking, what do we do about these?
What do you worry that we may see, what we walk into? It's not going to be, oh, well, that's over, the bomb's gone off, we hid in the bunkers and now we're out. What do you fear might be the new landscape? Will it be a continuation of these measures, which, as you say, we don't have evidence for? And what would you like to see?
Well, what I see is this entrenching of things like face coverings, physical distancing, aggressive testing, the use of of immunity documents to access jobs, public buildings, international travel. I mean, again, it's this failure to recognise what the vaccine does is to protect you. So knowing about anybody else's status is irrelevant. Once you're vaccinated, this is giving you a very high degree of protection against being sick enough to need to go to hospital. And even if you do need to go to hospital, the likelihood of you dying after you get there